Dr. William Lane Craig has argued for the existence of God based on the beginning of the universe. His argument goes like this. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. And he goes on to analyze what sort of cause that must be, and he argues that it must be God. Dr. Craig gives a very simple defense of this argument in this animated video. A big portion of that video focuses on the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. So I invited a Christian who is a theoretical physicist to comment on Dr. Craig's scientific case. My guest is Dr. Tom Rudelius. He's a professor at Durham University.
But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. Let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy. And that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning.
Okay, so let's talk about that second law of thermodynamics. It seems like the argument there is that if the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. But the universe hasn't run out of usable energy by now, so the universe hasn't been here forever. That seems to be the argument. What do you make of that argument?
Yes, I think that this is a nice, almost historical introduction to how people thought about the age of the universe, at least in my understanding of the history of science, which admittedly is not perfect. But this is, I think, a very reasonable thing, something that people thought of, that you go back a couple hundred years as the laws of thermodynamics were being developed and understood. That this is something that stands out, is that the second law of thermodynamics tells us systems are basically progressing to this state of maximum entropy. And the fact that we are living in a universe that clearly isn't in its state of maximum entropy, from the fact that we exist and the fact that there's an arrow of time, the world would be super different, right, if that were the case. So it does tell you that sort of the present state of the universe, or this increasing entropy that we're experiencing, that can't have been going on forever. But it also leaves open the possibility that maybe something very different was happening at some point in the past, that somehow maybe this universe that as we know it and experience it has only been around a finite time, but maybe there's something very different before that. And I think I'll have maybe more to say about that as we go on. But I guess I would say also very fair point this isn't an underhanded thing to point out. Very reasonable, something that did affect people's thinking about this question.
Okay, so now they're going to go through some other pieces of evidence. So I guess the first piece of evidence that we're being asked to consider is that the universe hasn't run out of usable energy yet. We're not at this maximum state of entropy, as you put it. Okay, so that's the first piece, and you say that's a reasonable piece of evidence that points to the beginning of the universe. It's not conclusive. There may be something else going on in the early universe, but it's fair to use that as a piece of evidence to consider. Let's keep going.
In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the redshift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension.
Okay, so that first piece of evidence was about entropy. The second piece of evidence is about the expansion of the universe. The universe is expanding, and there's this point in the finite past at which I think the video said the universe sprang into being, is how it put it. Mm-hmm. So what do you make of that point?
Yeah, so similar. I think very fair point, very important in the history of people thinking about the age of the universe, but also leaves open a bit of a loophole at the beginning. So first of all, it is true that Friedman and Robertson, Walker, Lemaitre did this work understanding the theory of cosmological expansion. I actually, just by coincidence, have a bunch of those equations up on my board today. I was just talking about it. Indeed, that is true. And then Hubble comes along, and it's an interesting historical point that Hubble actually, I think, when he measured the expansion of the universe, he was off by a factor of 7 or something. Which raises the question, did he actually even measure anything at all? Like, when you're off by a factor of 7, like, that's a huge difference.
Mm.
But since then, like, the reason we know that he was off by a factor of 7 is that people have measured it much more precisely. There's still a little bit of debate about what the exact value of the Hubble parameter is, but it's very clear, I think, to everyone that it's greater than 0, which means, in other words, the universe is in fact expanding, that distant galaxies are expanding away from us. And if you indeed follow the best fit model of cosmology backwards in time, you get to this point where everything is, the whole universe as we see it, gets smaller and smaller, right? If you're going backwards in time, the opposite of expansion is contraction. So you go backwards in time, everything is contracting and contracting. And eventually you get to a point where classical general relativity is going to break down. And at that point, you're going to need to understand basically the quantum theory of gravity to understand what's happening at that singularity. It's similar to what happens at the center of a black hole, that there's another cosmological singularity where in classical general relativity, basically the equations break down. And the lesson isn't necessarily that like physics stops. It just means that you need a new theory of physics, a quantum theory of gravity, which is something we don't understand very well. So yeah, so that's where this, I think, leaves off, is it's pointing us towards some era in the early universe where we have a quantum theory of gravity.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm tracking with you, the theory of general relativity is being used as a piece of evidence for the beginning of the universe. That theory it can't take us all the way to a beginning of the universe, it seems like you're saying. It sounds like it can take us really far back, but can't get us all the way to a beginning, because at a certain point that the equations no longer describe the conditions of the early universe. This would be something incredibly small, and you would need something like quantum theory to describe what's going on there. But if you acknowledge that quantum theory is what describes that early universe, now quantum theory doesn't necessarily point to a beginning of the universe. Is that fair?
I'd say, yeah. So, and maybe I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, that it's getting us to a point where you're going to need some quantum theory of gravity. And then, you raise an interesting question of what does that tell us about the beginning? And maybe I'll hold off on that, because I think there's a little left of this video. But yeah, it's, as far as you can see, as far as we understand, everything's getting smaller and smaller. And it's like you're watching a movie and you can tell what's going to happen. But then, like, it cuts off just a little bit before you actually get to see the, like, hero triumph or whatever, the final climactic moment. It's a little bit like that, where we understand what we understand really looks like it's heading towards the beginning. But then it comes to a point where the equations as we know them don't work, as you say. So yeah, let me come back to that in a moment.
I like that analogy. I
Okay,
haven't heard that before, but that's a good analogy.
I invented it on the spot. Yeah.
Okay, so those were the two pieces of evidence we're considering: entropy and the expansion of the universe. I think he's using these as they maybe point to the beginning of the universe, but it's not that they force you to conclude that the universe had a beginning.
I think that's accurate. Yeah.
Okay, so let's continue with the video.
Not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time.
Several like little signs fell over there, and each one has a different name. All the video really says is one by one, these didn't work anymore. People came to reject these. So the first one is steady state. I'll just list these and then you can pick if you want to describe them. Steady state, oscillating model, vacuum fluctuation, and eternal inflationary. I think those are the only 4.
Yeah, man, I feel like I could talk for a long time about these, and some of them I also don't understand as well as I'd like to. But I feel like it's not right to maybe put them all into the same category, because the things I would say about them are like totally different. So the first one, the one that's probably easiest is steady state. The steady state universe was an idea before the expansion of the universe was discovered, the idea that the universe wasn't expanding. That one has indeed been like conclusively ruled out by the discovery that the universe is expanding. The other ones, I would say, for instance, this oscillating model, that hasn't been ruled out, but it's also never really gained traction, because the mechanism by which the universe would transition from like contract, like the idea behind the oscillating universe is the universe, there's like a big bang and the universe gets big. And then there's a big crunch and the universe contracts down. And then there's another big bang and another big crunch and it oscillates. And the reason why that model has never really gained much traction is that nobody really understands the process by which you transition from a contracting universe to an expanding one. So I would say that model is very unpopular among theoretical physicists and cosmologists as a whole, but not sure if it tried to say that it's been like ruled out or discarded necessarily. The eternal inflation, I think, was maybe the other one, in vacuum fluctuation.
And then eternal inflationary are the two that remain.
Yeah, I think he's about to say a little bit more about eternal inflation. So why don't I withhold saying anything about those for now?
All right. Then we'll continue. So we're going to pick up with the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem.
Alban Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin prove that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history, not be eternal in the past, must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model.
Okay, so let me stop there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and how decisively does it really point to the beginning of the universe?
Yeah. First of all, I'd say I think it's pretty impressive that Borde-Guth-Vilenkin is quoted by this video. That's pretty high level physics, and I wouldn't expect too many lay people to know of it. I know it's become a big deal within the theological discussion, but I think that is in part because of like William Lane Craig and people. So I think I'd applaud people for doing the research to recognize that this exists in the first place. I'd say, yeah, I think it's a similar view to what I was saying about the expansion in the universe earlier. So let me give a little bit of background here. When he talks about the multiverse, that what he's talking about there is that eternal inflation universe. The idea behind eternal inflation is basically that it's like this accelerated exponential growth of the universe that somehow, in ways that aren't worth going into, gives rise to these different like pocket universes, which could have different laws of physics. And so this is an idea for how to get this multiverse. The multiverse is an important question for the fine-tuning argument about the existence of God, but that's really a different question. So let's stick with this question: does the universe have a beginning? Now, what you might have thought is, okay, if with eternal inflation, just by the name itself, right? You might think, okay, could this maybe go on forever? Yeah, sure. Like maybe our universe, our little pocket universe, seems to only be finite in time. But maybe when you put it in the context of this larger, eternally inflating multiverse, that maybe that could go on forever, even if our particular universe ends. And so maybe that could solve the issue. What Borde-Guth and Vilenkin argued under some seemingly reasonable assumptions is that even in eternal inflation, you eventually you get to a past boundary of the universe. That there's some place where the universe has got to come to a stop and you got to impose some initial conditions. I think the issue with this, or like the last thing, is this question of what exactly is that telling us? Because Borde-Guth and Vilenkin are relying also on a like classical general relativity. In their scenario as well, I think that what you can conclude is that you get to a point where classical general relativity breaks down and you need some quantum theory. And this is also what the quantum oscillations or whatever the sign was that fell down, something about quantum oscillations. That you could wonder, well, it could have just been that our universe, that we have this quantum theory of gravity that describes the universe forever. And I think that's like a logical possibility because we really don't understand quantum gravity very well at all. But I think that, so within quantum gravity, it's expected that what will somehow happen is that space and even time itself should emerge from more fundamental constituents. And so that when we get back to this period of quantum gravity, this singularity where quantum gravity takes over, that somehow the notion of time itself is going to cease to be valid. And I think that to me leaves me confused when it comes to these philosophical discussions, because as a physicist, I think I can say it seems likely, they're not definitive, but very likely that our universe had a beginning at some point in the finite past. That is, that only a finite amount of classical time has ever taken place in our universe. That's what I think all of these arguments that are being given in the video are pointing to that. And I think that's a very reasonable conclusion. But then the question is, suppose that you get to a point isn't just like a beginning. It's a place where even time itself ceases to make sense. And somehow time emerges from some more fundamental constituents, some more fundamental degrees of freedom. How am I supposed to think about that philosophically? I think that even if we actually gained a much better understanding to the point that we could understand physically how the universe came into existence, like we had some mathematical equations that describe how you get a universe to come into existence, I think that still wouldn't address this metaphysical question, because the argument itself doesn't say anything about, oh, we can't have a physical explanation. We can't have equations that describe this, right? Like, even if you have equations, Stephen Hawking famously observed, even if there's an equation that describes how the universe comes into existence or that describes everything in the universe, you still have this question of what is it that breathes life into these equations? What is it that breathes fire into these equations and gives them a universe to describe? What is it that causes this universe to start to exist? So I think that, I don't know, I guess that's where I'm at. I think that it's more likely than not, but not impossible, that our universe came into existence a finite time in the past. I'm confused about the philosophical and metaphysical implications of this. And I think that on this video in particular, there are some places where it's been a little bit fast and loose, or maybe not explained things fully, but I don't think it's like way off base. So yeah, that's my final take.
Just to make sure that I'm tracking with you and
Please,
tie
please.
this all together. We're looking at that second premise in the argument. The claim is the universe began to exist, and you say it seems that that is more likely true than false, though not certain.
Yeah,
That's the point. It's okay. So I just from having seen what Craig says about this argument and other arguments and so on, that's all he's going for. He'll say, hey, I'm just trying to put forward premises that are more likely true than not. So I would guess that Craig would see that and say, aha, so premise 2 gets a check mark, and then it comes down to the truth of premise 1 before you get this conclusion that the universe has a cause. So you said you're confused about the kind of philosophical or metaphysical implications of the universe beginning to exist. Part of the challenge is making sense of what's going on with time.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, can you expand on that? Is it that
Sure. Yeah.
time, I think you called it classical time. It's when we get beyond classical time, is that what makes you maybe question whether the universe began to exist? Or are you saying, no, I think it's likely that the universe began to exist, but I don't know what really follows from that because this non-classical time? Yeah,
Yeah.
if you can just elaborate on that, that
Let
might
me,
help me a little.
And I'm not sure if I can, I'm confused too, so I'm not sure I can give you the best explanation, but I guess what I'd say is, when we talk about time beginning to exist, and the question, did time begin to exist? I guess the point I want to make is that when we get back to those very earliest moments where like classical general relativity breaks down and we need a quantum theory of gravity, time itself isn't necessarily a well-defined concept, which therefore also means that beginning is not necessarily a well-defined concept. But did the universe, the only way, like the way that I can make sense of that, the best way I can make sense of that is to ask, like, does the amount of time, when I can make sense of time, did that go on into eternity past, right? And I think is much more likely no than yes, but not conclusively. There are ways, there are like these cyclic models that you can write down, very speculative models. I think much more likely if you're hitting a wall of ignorance, it's unlikely that on the other side of that wall of ignorance is just more time. To me, it seems a lot more likely that we just hit a wall of ignorance and something else completely different takes over. So I think if you're asking me, do I think that the universe began in the sense that there's only been a finite amount of classical time, as far as time makes sense, did that happen a finite time ago? I think yes. More likely yes than no. But as I say, again, that moment where time began is a moment where time doesn't really make sense. And I really wish I understood that better, because if I did, I would be getting a lot more like papers and citations and stuff But it's a very hard question, very difficult. We understand quantum gravity only in very simple cases. We don't yet know enough about it to answer those questions. I guess that's where I say it becomes confusing, because once you enter that quantum realm, the question, I don't even understand the question anymore. I don't even understand the question of, did the universe begin? It's like, what is time? And therefore, what is beginning? And that's where things just get more complicated. Yeah. So I guess the question I want to ask William Lane Craig then is that good enough? Because because now we get into questions about the philosophy of time and the metaphysics of time. And maybe that's good enough for him, but I just don't really know that part of the argument.
Okay. One more question. You know how you gave that movie analogy earlier? You can find clips like these on the internet where stars are moving away from each other. So that's like our movie, and we hit rewind. And so
Yeah.
stars and everything start getting closer and closer to closer. And so they're getting really close, and then the movie cuts off. Okay.
Yes.
When it comes to classical time, is what you're saying, if we were watching that movie, it's like classical time, but the movie cuts. Now it's not classical time anymore, and we don't really know what's going on there. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
I know it's an analogy, so it can't be perfect.
It's possible that there is more time, but the issue is that in general relativity, like space-time itself, time and space are just like degrees of freedom. You have the space-time manifold, and then in quantum gravity, somehow that those things must be like quantized, for lack of a better term. They must be like understood as quantum objects. They no longer behave the way that you're accustomed to them behaving, is I guess the main thing, right? Is that you can't think of them the way that you're used to thinking about them, which is it's really hard to wrap your head around. And the thing is, we don't even understand how, like the equations for these things, right? We don't even understand like how this works yet, and we may never. So it's like hard enough to wrap your head around strange stuff that we do understand mathematically, let alone things that we just don't even really know yet. So it's, you get to a point where it's just like ignorance. You just get to a wall of ignorance. And yeah, I guess the way I see it, it feels a little bit like Occam's razor, where if the universe was going to exist forever, it could have done so in a very simple way. Like you could have had a steady state universe. You could have had a universe with no cosmological expansion at all. Like you could have had other things. So the fact that we have had all these discoveries, I think that it is definitely pointing us to some sort of quantum gravity regime, some sort of singularity. I think that's very reasonable to believe in. But yeah, then the real confusion starts at that point.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Last question. Maybe this backs us out from this particular topic. So you are a theist, and as far as I know, you're actually a Christian. Is there something in your field that you would say, yeah, I'm more comfortable pointing to that as evidence for theism than the beginning of the universe, say?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that the Kalam argument is like a bad argument or that it's obviously wrong, but it is one that I'm just a bit more uncertain about because of the metaphysical questions involved. I think for me, and if I could be so bold, I would say that this seems to be true of other theists and Christians in my field, that the two arguments that are maybe a bit closer to home for us that we would turn to are the contingency arguments and the fine-tuning argument. So fine-tuning is very much related to the sorts of things I work on, and I've written a lot about this. I've blogged about it, for instance, a number of times. And basically, I think that we mentioned the multiverse in this video. I think that it's definitely like very plausible that a multiverse exists, but I think that it really doesn't help it doesn't fix the fine-tuning argument. That it helps a little bit. It's like maybe the start of an atheistic response to the fine-tuning argument. But I think to me, there's a lot of aspects of our universe that even quote citing a multiverse isn't going to fix. So I think that's a good argument. I also think that, the contingency argument is this question of, it's similar. I think some would even call it a version of the cosmological argument, but it's not so focused on time because, as you've learned from this, I'm very confused about time. But it's just a question of, it comes from the question of why is there something rather than nothing? Or the way I tend to think about it, why these equations and not other equations? That in my experience, like I deal with all sorts of equations of different cosmologies that seem to be perfectly respectable universes out there. But why do we live in this particular one, right? In this particular world? And that's where kind of fine tuning, I think, comes in, because it suggests that maybe the reason, like maybe the thing that's special about this universe is that these are what the laws need to be like in order for intelligent life to exist. So to me, I think the question of why any universe at all, but then why this particular one? What is it that breathes fire into these particular equations? To me, that gets me on the track, and then fine-tuning, and then some of the other arguments for the existence of God, to me, makes a pretty compelling case.
At the end of the interview, Dr. Rudelius mentioned the fine-tuning argument, and he seems to think that that's pretty good evidence for theism. Dr. Craig has made another animated video summarizing his fine-tuning argument. So I invited another Christian on, who's an expert on the fine-tuning argument, to comment. If you want to watch that, click here.